Walter Grant always believed that life was a constant cycle of work and rewards. At 72 years old, he had reaped more than most could ever dream of. From a young age, he had dived headfirst into the business world, building an empire spanning various industries, from real estate to investments in technology and manufacturing. Now retired, he was a man who could proudly say he had secured his family's future for generations. However, professional success wasn't the only thing that shaped Walter. Years ago, he had also been passionate about a different part of life that he had set aside: motorsports. It was something that made him feel free and invincible. His cars were like trophies to him, tangible reminders of his accomplishments. In the 1980s and 1990s, Walter was a frequent participant in amateur racing circuits. With his collection of luxury and sports cars, he dominated competitions and displayed his machines at renowned events. His garage was a veritable gallery of automotive art: Porsches, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, each representing a milestone in his rise to success. However, over time, as his business grew and his responsibilities increased, Walter had to abandon his hobby. The pressures of running a company, raising his children, and later caring for his grandchildren consumed all his energy and focus. Gradually, his collection was sold, and racing became a distant memory. Now, with his company in the hands of trusted managers and his sons Matthew and David well established in their careers, Walter began to realize that time for himself had finally arrived. His grandchildren were in college, and without the weight of daily responsibilities, the passion for motorsports reignited within him. That morning, Walter woke up with a clear purpose: he was going to return to his old passion. He had decided to start building a new collection of luxury cars. But this time, the goal wasn't to compete with other businessmen or collectors. Now, it was personal, a way to relive his youth and reconnect with a part of himself that had been forgotten. Without thinking much about his appearance, Walter chose something comfortable to wear. He picked an old t-shirt, the kind he wore on days spent at home, paired with worn-out jeans and casual shoes. He saw no reason to dress up extravagantly to buy a car. After all, he didn't need to impress anyone. His days of worrying about appearances were long behind him, and the fortune in his bank account was all he needed to ensure he could acquire any vehicle he wanted. His modest car, a sedan he kept purely for practicality, waited for him in the garage. He had already done his research and knew exactly where he was going: Elite Motors, one of the largest luxury car dealerships in the city. The dealership was known for its exclusive vehicles: Lamborghinis, Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, and Walter knew it would be the perfect place to start his new collection. As he drove through the city, he felt a flutter of excitement. Not from nerves, but from anticipation. It was almost as if he was returning to a world he already knew, but in a renewed way. He allowed himself to smile as he imagined how great it would feel to once again have those powerful cars in his garage, ready to hit the road. As he approached Elite Motors, the impressive glass facade gleamed in the morning sun. The luxury cars displayed in the showroom were like jewels on display, reflecting the success and sophistication the dealership promised. Walter felt a slight wave of nostalgia seeing those vehicles and remembering the days when he displayed his own cars at collectors' gatherings. He parked the sedan casually, not caring that his discreet vehicle stood out among the elegant cars around him. As he stepped out of the car, Walter straightened his posture and glanced around. There was no rush. He was there to enjoy himself and, of course, make a major purchase. However, as he began walking toward the dealership's entrance, Walter sensed something different in the air. Subtle but clearly suspicious glances came from inside the store. He saw the salespeople exchanging looks, speaking quietly, and glancing him up and down. Walter, despite it all, wasn't bothered. He had always believed that appearances said nothing about a person's character. But at that moment, he could already sense that something was coming. When Walter Grant walked through the glass doors of Elite Motors, a soft chime rang, but the sound went unnoticed by the salespeople. The interior was as luxurious as the cars on display. The marble floor gleamed under the lights, and every detail of the store seemed carefully chosen to impress clients with good taste and, of course, money. Walter stepped forward, admiring the shiny cars. There, under the showroom lights, were some of the most coveted machines in the world. Models of Lamborghinis, Ferraris, and Rolls-Royces filled the space as if they were works of art. He recalled his collector days when cars like these were symbols of his personal success. It was as if he was reliving a forgotten part of his own story. However, as Walter approached one of the cars, he noticed he wasn't getting the attention he expected. There were two salespeople chatting near the reception desk, and although they clearly noticed him, neither of them moved to assist. They glanced at him over their shoulders and returned to their conversation as if he were irrelevant. Walter, remaining calm, walked over to one of the showroom's most imposing cars, a black Lamborghini Aventador, and began inspecting its details. As he ran his hand over the bodywork, he heard a stifled laugh from behind. "Does this guy even know the price of that car?" one of the salesmen whispered to the other. Mark, the store manager, watched from a distance. He was a man in his 40s, wearing a well-tailored suit and exuding an air of superiority. As soon as he saw Walter, dressed in simple clothes and with his casual demeanor, Mark immediately formed an opinion. To him, Walter was just another old man who, at most, was there to take pictures of the cars or dream about something he could never afford. Mark sighed, adjusted his suit, and walked over to Walter, adopting a formal posture. He had already decided that this interaction would be quick. "May I help you, sir?" Mark asked with a forced smile. Walter, unaware of the initial condescension, smiled back. "Sure. I'm interested in this Lamborghini. Do you have any other high-performance models you could show me?" he asked, with a calmness that didn't match the reaction Mark was expecting. Mark raised an eyebrow. "A Lamborghini? This man? This is one of our most exclusive models. The prices here aren't exactly affordable, you know?" Mark replied, emphasizing the word exclusive with a sarcastic smile. Walter showed no sign of irritation. He simply ignored the tone and continued. "I understand, but I'm more interested in learning about the performance. Do you have another model you would recommend?" Walter pointed to a Ferrari nearby. Mark hesitated for a moment. He could see that Walter wasn't leaving the store, and he probably needed a more direct push. "Sir," Mark stepped closer, lowering his voice as if revealing a secret, "I think you're in the wrong place. We have vehicles in other price ranges, at more accessible dealerships, if that's what you're looking for." Mark's tone finally revealed what had been implied all along. He was judging Walter not by the questions he asked, but by the way he was dressed. To Mark, it didn't matter that Walter was interested in a Lamborghini. He had already decided that Walter couldn't afford a luxury car. Walter, now realizing the prejudice behind Mark's words, felt a slight discomfort but didn't lose his characteristic calm. He knew exactly who he was and what he was capable of. Mark's behavior, though annoying, wasn't going to shake him. "You think I'm in the wrong place?" Walter asked, challenging the manager with a serene expression. Mark, not sensing the implicit challenge, nodded with a look of false concern. "I'm just trying to help you find something within your budget, sir," he said, briefly glancing at Walter's simple clothes. Walter remained silent for a moment. He knew that arguing here wouldn't lead anywhere. He had been underestimated before, but this time, he had something different in mind. There was a lesson Mark and his employees needed to learn. "I appreciate your suggestion," Walter said calmly, "but I think I'll seek service elsewhere." As he prepared to leave, Emma, a young salesperson who had been watching from a distance, took a few steps toward Walter. She seemed uncomfortable with the situation, but Mark restrained her with a gesture, signaling for her not to intervene. Satisfied with himself, Mark turned to Emma and the other employees with a triumphant look. "These people think they can just come in here and look around, like it's some kind of amusement park," he laughed, completely unaware that he had just made a huge mistake. As Walter exited the store, he took one last glance at the cars in the showroom. He wasn't angry. In fact, a slight smile formed on his lips. It was almost ironic. He had spent a lifetime dealing with this kind of attitude, from people who underestimated his abilities. But now, he had the power to change that narrative. and he was more than willing to do so. "We'll see who's in the wrong place," he murmured to himself, already forming a plan in his mind. Leaving Elite Motors, Walter got into his car, and for the first time in a long while, he felt energized. He wasn't angry, but there was a certain pleasure in knowing that he was about to teach a lesson to those who had underestimated him. The old Walter, the business magnate he had been for decades, awakened inside him. And although he was retired, the feeling of orchestrating a meticulous plan was something he couldn't resist. He drove calmly back home, where the warm, simple environment awaited him. Walter's house, despite his fortune, always reflected his humble and practical personality. He was never the type to flaunt his wealth with extravagant mansions. To him, the value of life was in experiences and connections, not in status symbols. As soon as he entered the living room, Walter picked up his phone and dialed the number of his trusted lawyer, Arthur Price. Arthur had been by his side for decades, handling his most complex transactions and ensuring everything ran smoothly. He wasn't someone Walter turned to often, but when he did, Arthur knew something big was in play. "Arthur, how are you?" Walter began in his calm voice, but with a slight energy that Arthur hadn't heard in a long time. "Walter. It's been a while. What brings the pleasure?" Arthur responded in a friendly tone. Walter got straight to the point, wasting no time on formalities. "I need you to investigate the financial situation of a dealership called Elite Motors. I want to know if it's for sale or in financial trouble." Walter's tone was simple, but Arthur knew what it meant. "Interesting. Any special reason for the interest?" Arthur asked, already anticipating there was more to the story than Walter was letting on. "Let's just say I had an interesting experience there today. I think I can help them, in a way they're not expecting." Walter smiled, recalling Mark and his arrogance. Arthur knew this meant Walter had a deeper plan in mind, and he wouldn't question it. Walter wasn't the type to act impulsively. There was always a solid reason behind every move, and that's what had led him to success. "Leave it to me. I'll check things out and get back to you with the information shortly," Arthur said before hanging up. Walter knew Arthur would handle it quickly. As he waited, he allowed himself to relax a bit, reflecting on the day. He thought of the young salesperson, Emma, who had seemed different from the other employees. Her expression of discomfort and empathy when Mark treated him poorly had caught Walter's attention. He knew how to recognize good people, and Emma was one of them. Perhaps, in some way, she could become an ally in what was to come. The phone rang shortly after. It was Arthur. "Walter, you were right. Elite Motors is in trouble. The owner is willing to sell the business, and not only that, they're desperate for a buyer with a good name. It seems they haven't been able to stay in the black for the past few months," Arthur explained. Walter smiled to himself. The perfect opportunity. "Great, Arthur. I want you to finalize the purchase as quickly as possible, without revealing that I'm the buyer." "I want to keep this quiet for now," Walter requested, already thinking about his return to the dealership. "No problem. I'll handle it personally. Within 24 hours, Elite Motors will be yours," Arthur confirmed. Walter thanked him and hung up. The plan was in motion. That night, Walter slept with the tranquility of someone who knew they were in control. He had faced far more complicated situations in his business life, but something about this one amused him. It wasn't just about showing his power. For him, it was more about correcting a wrong, ensuring that those who judged by appearances learned something valuable. The next morning, Walter woke up early. He knew it would be an important day. He dressed carefully, but this time chose something a bit more fitting for the occasion. He still didn't care about expensive suits, but opted for a black leather jacket and a simple shirt, something that better suited the new Walter, the car collector. And to make his grand entrance, he decided to drive one of his old cars, a Porsche 911, which he had kept over the years. The engine roared under his feet, bringing back memories of when he ruled the racetracks. When he arrived at Elite Motors, the silver Porsche gleamed in the sunlight, catching the attention of all the salespeople, who stopped what they were doing to see who the customer was. It was impossible to ignore the sound of the engine, and Walter could see from the surprised faces that the salespeople were wondering who the man behind the wheel was. Walter parked the Porsche calmly and stepped out of the car with the confidence of someone who knew they were now in control of the situation. "Who is that guy?" one of the salespeople whispered, clearly impressed by the car. Mark, the manager who had humiliated him the day before, watched from a distance, wearing an uncertain expression. He didn't immediately recognize Walter, but he knew that car wasn't something just anyone drove. Walter looked around the store, observing every detail and every person, already knowing that everything there now belonged to him. He smiled to himself and, without haste, walked toward the dealership entrance. The salespeople's eyes followed him, but this time, there was respect and admiration. Walter felt like a conductor about to begin a symphony, knowing that every note was already prepared. The show was about to begin. Walter entered Elite Motors with steady, deliberate steps. This time, there was a different energy in his posture. He knew that everything there belonged to him now, though no one else knew it yet. The air inside the dealership was thick with anticipation. The salespeople who had ignored him the day before couldn't take their eyes off the Porsche 911 he had parked right in front of the entrance. They were watching with curiosity and a hint of reverence, wondering what would happen next. Walter kept his gaze focused, paying little attention to the salespeople. His plan was clear in his mind, and he wanted to savor every moment. Mark, the manager, watched from his desk at the back. When he saw Walter enter, he immediately recognized him. His lofty, confident posture disappeared for a brief moment, replaced by an expression of confusion and discomfort. Mark didn't know how to react. The man he had dismissed the day before was back, but this time, driving a luxury car that easily cost 3 times the annual salary of anyone in the store. Trying to hide his discomfort, Mark stood up from his desk and approached with a forced smile, attempting to regain control of the situation. "I see you're back, sir." Mark began, but his voice faltered when he realized he didn't know Walter's name. He tried to seem friendly, but there was a noticeable tension in his tone. "Is that Porsche yours?" Walter looked at him, analyzing him for a moment before responding simply. "Yes, it's mine." His voice was firm but not arrogant. He was just stating a fact. Mark, still unsure how to handle the situation, let out a nervous laugh. "Well, it's an incredible car. It looks like you really know your luxury vehicles." I'd like to apologize for yesterday. There might have been a misunderstanding. We didn't mean to seem." Mark hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Disrespectful." Walter kept his expression neutral. He knew Mark was trying to smooth things over, but he also knew the apology wasn't sincere, it was just an attempt to avoid trouble. "Disrespectful?" Walter repeated, looking directly at Mark. "Is that what you think it was? A misunderstanding?" Mark swallowed hard, realizing the situation was worsening. He glanced around, noticing that the other salespeople were watching intently. The tension in the air was palpable. Mark began to speak, but was interrupted when Walter calmly raised a hand, silencing him. "Let me make something clear, Mark," Walter said, his voice low and controlled. "I walked in here yesterday like any customer, interested in buying a car. And what I received was a reception based on prejudice. Not because of what I said, but because of how I looked." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "That's unacceptable." Mark opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words didn't come out. He knew Walter was right, and he knew that any excuse he offered would sound hollow. "You're right, sir," Mark finally admitted, his voice lower. "It was a mistake on our part. I can assure you it won't happen again." Walter watched him for a moment, evaluating the sincerity in his words. He wanted to see how far Mark would go with his apology before dropping the bombshell. "Indeed, it won't happen again," Walter said, taking a small step forward, causing Mark to take a slight step back. "Because now I'll make sure of that." Mark frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" he asked, not fully understanding what was happening. It was at that moment that Walter revealed what he had been holding back since the beginning. He took a step to the side, looking around the dealership before finally returning his gaze to Mark. "I bought Elite Motors last night, Mark. I'm the new owner of this dealership." The impact of those words was immediate. Mark went pale, as if all the blood had drained from his face. He opened his mouth but couldn't form any words. The silence that followed was suffocating, and the other salespeople, who had been watching the interaction, froze where they stood, processing what they had just heard. Mark stammered, trying to collect his thoughts. You bought the dealership," he repeated, incredulous. Walter nodded calmly, without a hint of arrogance. He didn't need to. The power he held in that situation spoke for itself. "Yes. Now, let's talk about the future of this company," Walter said, his tone becoming more serious. "Because from what I saw yesterday, there are many things that need to change around here. And we're going to start with you." Mark was paralyzed. He knew his job was at risk, but he still wasn't sure how to handle the situation. He had completely underestimated Walter, and now he was at the mercy of the new owner. Mark began, but Walter interrupted him again. "You'll be fired, Mark, but I'm going to give you a choice," Walter said, looking him directly in the eyes. "You can leave now, with no chance of redemption, or you can stay and agree to undergo a re-education program. This includes publicly acknowledging your mistakes and going through rigorous customer service training. That's your only chance to stay." Mark's face was a mixture of shock and despair. He knew he was cornered. He could just walk away, but he would lose everything. And if he stayed, he would have to humble himself and admit his mistakes in front of everyone. Walter watched him carefully, knowing he had given him a difficult but fair choice. This was his chance for redemption if Mark had the courage to accept it. The silence stretched for a few seconds, as everyone waited for Mark's response. Finally, with a weak, resigned voice, he said, "I accept." Mark could barely get the words out, but his expression of defeat made it clear that he knew he had no other option. Walter nodded, satisfied, but without showing any sign of triumph. "Good. You'll begin your training tomorrow." He turned to the other employees, who were still in shock. "From now on, this dealership will run differently. Everyone here will be treated with respect, regardless of their appearance or financial status. If anyone has a problem with that, the doors are open for you to leave." The other salespeople said nothing. They knew the tide had completely shifted and that Walter was now in charge. The atmosphere in the store seemed to change completely. And in the back of the store, the young salesperson Emma, who had tried to intervene the day before, watched everything with a slight sense of satisfaction. She knew that things would never be the same there, and this time, for the better. Walter was in his new office at Elite Motors, a large, modern space that he now commanded as the new owner. He had never been in a hurry to take control, but the dealership and its staff were in urgent need of change. Around him, symbols of luxury and power were scattered, from the sophisticated furniture to the luxury cars parked in the showroom below. But what interested him most at that moment was the cultural reform he was determined to implement at the dealership. The morning after his big revelation brought a different atmosphere. There was a tense mood among the employees, especially among the salespeople who had participated in or witnessed the unfair treatment Walter received from Mark. Rumors were already circulating. The new owner was the man they kicked out the day before. And no matter how much they tried to stay focused on their work, the employees' eyes were constantly on Walter. Mark arrived early, as requested, to begin his training. His expression was one of resignation. The smug smile he had once worn was gone, replaced by a mix of regret and anxiety. He knew he couldn't escape the choice he had made. If he wanted to keep his job, he would have to face the training and reconcile with his own pride. Walter watched him from a distance, while Emma, the young salesperson who had shown empathy, began her day more calmly. She was still surprised by everything that had happened, but there was a sense of relief that she was finally working in a place where respect would be the norm. Walter called Mark into his office for a conversation before the training began. Mark entered with his head down, clearly uncomfortable. "Mark, sit down," Walter said calmly, pointing to the chair in front of his desk. Mark obeyed without saying a word. The silence in the room was heavy. "I'm not a man of revenge, Mark," Walter began. "I could have fired you yesterday, and I think many would say you deserved it. But I believe in something more important, learning. We all make mistakes, and what defines who we are is what we do after we make them." Mark looked up, surprised by Walter's approach. He had expected a harsher reprimand, maybe even humiliation, but Walter's tone was different. "I want you to understand something, Mark. What happened here wasn't just your mistake. It was the mistake of the entire team. It reflects a bigger problem, a culture of disrespect, of snap judgments, of not seeing people beyond the surface." Walter spoke firmly, but without anger. Mark slowly nodded, realizing that what Walter was saying was true. He knew his behavior wasn't just a personal failure, but something rooted in how he and many of his colleagues viewed the world. "So, the question is," Walter continued, "are you going to accept this training and go through the necessary re-education? This includes publicly acknowledging what you did wrong. And I'm not just talking about apologizing to me. I'm talking about apologizing to the whole team, because you're a leader here. If you don't change, no one will. And honestly, I don't want someone like you here if you're not willing to learn." Mark swallowed hard. The idea of publicly apologizing made him deeply uncomfortable, but he knew he had no choice. He had made a serious mistake, and it was that or lose his job and reputation. "I accept, Mr. Grant," Mark finally said, his voice heavy with resignation. "I'll do whatever it takes to correct my mistakes." Walter watched Mark for a moment, assessing the sincerity in his words. He didn't expect Mark to completely change overnight, but he wanted to see the first step toward that change. "All right. The training starts now. You'll also have an active role in the re-education of the other employees. I want you to be the example. This won't be easy, but if you commit, there's room for redemption. And remember, this isn't about me. It's about how we treat every person who walks through those doors." Mark nodded again, still struggling to process everything that was being demanded of him. But he knew he had no other choice. With Mark beginning his training, Walter turned his attention to the rest of the team. He knew that for the change to be effective, he needed new internal leadership. And that's where Emma came in. Walter called Emma into his office shortly after Mark left. She entered, still a bit nervous, but clearly more comfortable than the other employees. "Emma, I watched you yesterday," Walter began. "And I saw something in you that the others don't have. I saw empathy. I saw respect. And that's what we need here. That's what I need as the new owner of this dealership." Emma blushed slightly but smiled, surprised by the recognition. "I've always believed that every customer deserves to be treated with respect, no matter who they are," she said honestly. "Exactly. And that's why I want you to take on a leadership role here. Starting today, you'll be the new sales manager at Elite Motors. I know it's a big leap, but I have confidence that you'll be a fair and exemplary leader." Emma was visibly shocked by the offer. She had never expected something like this, especially so quickly. I don't know what to say, Mr. Grant. It's a big responsibility, but I'll do my best," she replied, still trying to process the sudden promotion. "I know you will. And don't worry, you'll have the support you need. We're going to transform this place, together." Walter smiled, feeling a genuine satisfaction in seeing that he was putting the right people in the right positions. Time passed quickly after Walter's big revelation. Elite Motors, which had once been just another luxury car dealership, had now transformed into a symbol of something much greater: respect, inclusion, and opportunities for redemption. The change didn't happen overnight, but under Walter's leadership, the store's atmosphere began to change dramatically. Mark, who initially struggled with his pride, went through the training Walter had required. He was forced to confront his own prejudices and publicly admit his mistakes. The humiliation he felt when apologizing in front of the entire team and the customers was hard, but it was also the first step toward redemption. During the training, Mark learned that true success didn't just come from selling expensive cars, but from treating every customer with dignity, regardless of their appearance. Walter closely supervised the process. He knew that Mark could become an important example for the other employees, and this learning opportunity wasn't just a chance to correct the mistake that had been made, but to transform the company's culture itself. And little by little, Mark began to show signs of genuine change. He became more attentive, more humble, and, to the surprise of many, even more effective in his sales, because now he treated everyone with respect and consideration. While Mark underwent his transformation, Emma flourished in her new role as sales manager. Her natural empathy and sense of justice made her an inspiring leader for the team. Under her management, the salespeople began to follow a new standard of customer service. The atmosphere that had once been laden with competition and arrogance was replaced by a welcoming environment, where every person who walked into the store was treated with respect. Walter, for his part, was completely satisfied. What had started as an unpleasant situation had turned into an opportunity to create something much greater than he had ever imagined. Elite Motors was no longer just a luxury dealership, it had become a symbol of transformation and how attitudes and behaviors could change for the better. The impact of the store's new culture spread quickly throughout the city, and soon, customers were returning to the dealership not only for the quality of the cars but for the way they were treated. Now, sitting in his office, Walter looked down at the showroom from the upper floor. The view of the space below, where he had once witnessed Mark's and his team's prejudice, now showed a completely different picture. Salespeople were chatting cheerfully with customers, without judgment, without rushing to impress. The store was alive in a way he had never imagined. Walter was content, but he knew it was time to pass the legacy on. He had done what needed to be done, and now, with Emma in charge, he knew the store was in good hands. The future of Elite Motors was secure. One day, as he watched Emma in a meeting with the team, Walter decided that this would be his last act of direct supervision at the dealership. The company was running perfectly, and his work there was complete. He no longer needed to be actively involved. It was time to return to his original passion, luxury cars and motorsports. "You're ready, Emma," Walter said to her, with a proud smile, when she came up for a brief conversation in his office. "I hope so, Mr. Grant. There's still so much to learn, but I'm doing my best," she replied, humbly. Walter nodded confidently. "You're already doing more than enough. The future of this dealership is yours. I'm leaving things under your command from now on." Emma smiled, surprised but proud. "Thank you for trusting me," she said. At that moment, Walter felt that the cycle was complete. He had passed on his experience, his values, and his example. Now, he could dedicate himself to what he loved most without the weight of business responsibilities. A few months later, Walter was at a luxury car event, where he finally returned to the racetrack, driving his Porsche 911, feeling the wind on his face and the adrenaline in his body. At the end of the race, as he parked his car with a smile on his face, he looked around and saw Mark and Emma in the crowd, waving and cheering for him. Walter waved back, knowing that more than cars and business, what he had left behind was something much more lasting, a legacy of transformation and respect. He didn't need applause or public recognition. His greatest triumph was silent, shaping the character of those around him and ensuring that, at Elite Motors, everyone was treated as they deserved. Walter Grant, the millionaire who had once walked into the dealership dressed simply and been underestimated, now bid farewell to Elite Motors knowing that his impact would endure. He had transformed not only the store but the lives of everyone there. And finally, he was free to enjoy what he had always loved, the cars, the road, and the freedom. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.